It was upon a bleak November morning, the sort of London day when the fog presses against the windows like a living thing, and the gas lamps burn with a weak orange tremor even at noon. I had just returned from my rounds at Paddington Hospital when I found my old friend Sherlock Holmes bent over a small violin case that did not, to my recollection, belong to him. The fire in our sitting room at 221B Baker Street had been stoked to a fierce glow. Yet Holmes himself sat with his usual languid composure, eyes half closed, fingers steepled, and an unreadable expression upon his sharp, ascetic face. He was not, as I first imagined, tuning the violin, but examining the case itself, particularly a series of faint scratches near the latch. "You appear to be engaged in a rather singular inspection, Holmes," I ventured, removing my gloves. If I did not know better, I should think that violin case held more than an instrument. "Your observation, my dear Watson, while imprecise, is not without merit," Holmes replied, without lifting his gaze. "This object was left at our door precisely 7 minutes ago by a woman whose gloved hand trembled, though not, I think, from the cold." Before I could inquire further, there came a sharp knock-to, deliberate raps upon the door. Mrs. Hudson, ever alert to such interruptions, admitted a young constable in the dark blue uniform of Scotland Yard. He looked harried, his cheeks flushed from the fog. "Beg pardon, Mr. Holmes." "Dr. Watson," said he, removing his cap. "Inspector Lestrade sent me, sir. He says it's urgent. A lady's gone missing from Dorset Square under the most peculiar circumstances. The only clue found at her residence was this." He handed Holmes a folded note. My companion opened it carefully, his grey eyes flickering over the words. It was written in a hurried feminine hand, the ink slightly smudged. He knocked twice. She was already gone. Holmes read it aloud, his tone measured and oddly distant. "Fascinating. The phrase implies anticipation, perhaps guilt or foreknowledge. And yet, it lacks a signature. Curious indeed. Was the lady wealthy?" he asked the constable. "Not exactly, sir. Miss Lydia Farnsworth. Lived alone, though she had a companion who claims she vanished between one knock and the next. Said she went to answer the door, and when she returned, Miss Farnsworth was gone." No sound, no struggle. Holmes rose abruptly, his eyes bright with that peculiar flame that I had learned to recognize as the herald of an intellectual storm. "Watson, your hat. Lestrade shall have the pleasure of our company within the quarter hour. There is, I fear, a mind at work here that does not abide by ordinary logic." As we stepped out into the swirling fog, I could not help but glance back toward the violin case upon our table. Its clasp was now shut. But in my brief look I thought I saw something glinting from within a thin, golden thread or wire. Holmes caught my gaze and smiled faintly. "All in good time, Watson," he murmured. "For the moment, let us see who knocked twice, and why the lady who should have answered was already gone." And with that, we hailed a hansom cab into the deep grey of the London mist. The hansom cab rolled through the murk of Baker Street and out toward Dorset Square, its lamps slicing narrow tunnels through the mist. The air was sharp with the metallic tang of rain yet to fall. Holmes sat opposite me, silent for most of the journey, his long fingers resting lightly upon his walking cane. From the occasional narrowing of his eyes, I could tell his mind was already running far ahead of us past the fog, past the ordinary facts of disappearance, and into some unseen pattern known only to himself. When at last the cab came to a halt before a modest townhouse of blackened brick, we were greeted by the unmistakable figure of Inspector Lestrade. He was stamping his feet upon the stoop and rubbing his gloved hands, his expression caught between irritation and relief. "Ah, there you are, Mr. Holmes. I was beginning to think you'd grown weary of London's mysteries and taken up fishing instead," Lestrade remarked, attempting cheerfulness. Holmes inclined his head. "You know well, Lestrade, that I prefer a puzzle that wriggles and bites back. Now then, Miss Farnsworth, tell me only what is not already in the newspapers." Lestrade gave a short laugh. Nothing's in the newspapers yet, thank heaven. Miss Lydia Farnsworth, 31, respectable family from Surrey. Living alone here for the past year. A companion by the name of Mrs. Clara Fielding attended her, an older widow. At 8 o'clock this morning, Mrs. Fielding heard a knock at the door. She went to answer it, found no one there, and when she returned, her mistress had vanished. All doors locked from the inside. No sign of struggle, no footprints in the garden, and nothing taken except the lady at herself. Holmes gave a soft hum of interest. Locked from the inside, you say? Delightful. Lead on. We entered the townhouse, and I was immediately struck by the uncanny stillness that hung over it. It was not the quiet of neglect, but rather of something paused mid-breath, like a play whose actors had fled the stage. The drawing room, where Miss Farnsworth had last been seen, was bright with the morning's weak light filtering through lace curtains. Upon the table lay a breakfast tray, toast untouched, coffee gone cold, a small vase with a single white rose beginning to wilt. A shawl was draped across the back of a chair. Nothing appeared disturbed, yet an odd sensation crept over me, as though the air itself remembered something it could not quite repeat. Holmes began his methodical circuit of the room. He moved with a peculiar grace, stooping to inspect the skirting board, the edges of the carpet, the faint smudges upon the window latch. I, as always, followed with notebook in hand, though my mind found little to record beyond his inscrutable gestures. At length, he paused by the fireplace, where a small quantity of grey ash still smouldered faintly. He stirred it with the poker, then withdrew a half-burnt scrap of paper and placed it upon the mantel. Note this, Watson. The ink here has been obliterated by heat, yet the fibres show that the paper was of fine linen stock. Such is not typically used for correspondence, but for personal journals. Our Miss Farnsworth, it seems, burned something of her own writing shortly before vanishing. A diary entry, perhaps, I suggested. Holmes made a soft sound. Neither assent nor denial. He turned next to the window. Observe the latch clean, recently oiled, unlike the others in this house. Someone wished it to open silently. Lestrade frowned. But the window overlooks the garden wall. There's no sign of entry or exit there. We checked. Checked for footprints, no doubt, Holmes replied. But did you check for impressions upon the ivy stems? Lestrade looked blank. Holmes smiled faintly. I thought not. He bent to the sill, pulling from his pocket a small magnifying lens. After a moment, he nodded to himself. Here is the trace of a gloved hand powdered with chalk, the kind used by artists to improve their grip on charcoal. Tell me, Lestrade, have you inquired into whether Miss Farnsworth had artistic acquaintances? She attended an art society once a month, I'm told, Lestrade said, consulting his notebook. Model sittings and the like. Nothing suspicious there. Holmes straightened, his expression sharpening. Suspicious, my dear Lestrade, is a relative term. It is suspicious enough that a woman who burned a page of her own writing should have oiled her window in advance of vanishing, and that a gloved hand, dusted with chalk, should have graced her window frame. No, there is purpose here. He turned suddenly toward the small writing desk in the corner and began opening drawers with rapid precision. From one, he withdrew a folded letter, sealed but unsent. Breaking the seal, he glanced over the contents, then handed it to me. It was addressed to Mr. Adrian Blythe, the Academy of Fine Arts, Fitzrovia. The letter, though unfinished, contained these words. I can no longer bear the shadow that follows each of your visits. You spoke of destiny, yet I fear what you call destiny is but deceit in finer dress. If you knock again, I shall not answer. The remainder trailed off in an inky scrawl. Holmes's eyes glittered. There, Watson, is our first true thread. The knock twice, I suspect, was the summons of this Adrian Blythe. Whether Miss Farnsworth fled him or was taken, that remains to be seen. Lestrade gave a snort. And what of that violin case you mentioned in your telegram, Holmes? Some connection? Holmes's lips curved in that half-smile that always set my nerves on edge. Curious. Connection, indeed. The lady who delivered it trembled, as I observed, and inside. He broke off, crouched again near the table, and ran a finger along the underside of the chair Miss Farnsworth had last occupied. When he withdrew his hand, he was holding a fine golden thread, identical to the one I had glimpsed earlier that morning. Inside, Holmes continued softly, was a similar thread wound about the bridge of the violin, a thread too strong for ornament and too fine for cord, the same that we find here, fibers of gilt silk, such as might be used for an artist's frame or a theatrical costume. Watson, I think our painter friend's palette holds darker shades than oil and pigment. He rose, pocketing the thread. Come, gentlemen, we must call upon the Academy before nightfall. There is more to this vanishing act than the absence of a woman. There is artifice deliberate, beautiful, and cruel. And as we stepped once more into the cold breath of the London fog, I could not shake the feeling that somewhere, perhaps in a studio thick with the scent of turpentine and deceit, a pair of eyes was watching, waiting for the next knock. The journey to Fitzrovia carried with it the dreary rhythm of rain tapping upon the cab's roof, the mist outside now thick enough to blur the outlines of entire buildings. Holmes sat in silence for most of it, his chin resting lightly upon his cane, his gaze fixed upon the shadowed streets beyond the glass. He had that curious stillness which always heralded a flurry of intellectual motion, a calm so absolute that I could almost hear the machinery of his mind whirring beneath it. When at last we arrived at the Academy of Fine Arts, the gaslights glowed like dull amber beads against the fog, casting long, uncertain shapes upon the wet cobblestones. The building itself loomed in solemn dignity, its facade adorned with stone reliefs of muses and painters long dead. Inside, the air was thick with the mingled scents of oil, varnish, and turpentine, a perfume that seemed half creative, half corrosive. A clerk in spectacles greeted us at the entrance and, upon hearing Holmes's name, promptly led us through a corridor lined with student sketches and into a studio filled with scattered canvases and the sound of quiet scraping. There, at an easel near the far window, stood a man of perhaps 35. Tall, thin, and strikingly pale, his dark hair swept back in careless disarray. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, revealing hands that trembled slightly as he cleaned his brushes. "Mr. Adrian Blythe?" Holmes asked, his tone deceptively mild. The man turned slowly, his expression that of one awakened from a dream. His eyes, grey, deep, and oddly luminous, studied us with detached curiosity. "Yes," he replied, his voice low and cultured. "And you are?" "Sherlock Holmes. And this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We come on behalf of Inspector Lestrade concerning the disappearance of Miss Lydia Farnsworth." For an instant, no more than a heartbeat, the name seemed to strike something within him. His hand froze mid-motion, the brush still dripping turpentine. Then, with a controlled breath, he set it aside. "Disappearance?" he echoed. "Surely you are mistaken. Miss Farnsworth often spoke rather of seclusion, of needing solitude for her nerves. I imagine she has taken herself to the coast, as she sometimes does." Holmes smiled faintly. "A plausible suggestion, Mr. Blythe. Yet one contradicted by the fact that her belongings remain untouched, her breakfast unfinished, and her letter to you." He paused, letting the words linger, unposted. Blythe's face drained of what little color it possessed. "Her letter? You have seen it?" "I have read enough to know that its tone was less affectionate than you might have wished," Holmes said. "She spoke of deceit, of destiny, and of knocking." Blythe's gaze flickered toward the crew floor. "I see. Then she has chosen to misjudge me. I can hardly defend myself against poetry written in fear." Holmes began to stroll about the studio, his eyes darting over the various canvases, portraits, landscapes, still lifes, all rendered in a style both elegant and strangely cold. Each subject seemed captured in a moment of stillness so profound it verged upon lifelessness. "Your work is admirable," Holmes murmured, "but there is a certain obsession with quietude, is there not? These faces, so composed one might almost say, waiting." Blythe gave a tight smile. "I paint serenity, Mr. Holmes. The calm that eludes us in life." Holmes stopped before a canvas turned to the wall. "And this one?" he asked, lightly touching the frame. "Why conceal it?" The artist hesitated. "An unfinished study," he said too quickly. "A failure." Holmes looked to Lestrade, who had accompanied us and now stood near the door, uncomfortable amid the smell of paint. "Would you be so kind, Lestrade, as to turn that canvas around?" With an exasperated sigh, the inspector obliged. As the painting came into view, a chill swept the room. It was a portrait of a woman, graceful, pale, her eyes half closed as though in reverie. There was no mistaking her likeness. It was Miss Lydia Farnsworth, but what arrested us most was not her resemblance, it was her posture. She was seated in the very chair we had seen in her drawing room, the same shawl upon her shoulders, the same wilted rose upon the table beside her. Every detail was exact. Too exact. Lestrade swore under his breath. Good Lord! He painted her like that before she vanished? Blythe's composure fractured. No. It was merely an exercise she sat for me last week. I never... Holmes stepped closer, examining the brushwork. His eyes narrowed. "Watson, observe here the gleam upon the brooch, the light along the cheek, fresh pigment. This was painted within the last 24 hours. Blythe took a step back, visibly trembling now. "You're mistaken. She came yesterday evening. She wished to reconcile." Holmes' gaze pierced him like a blade. "And yet, Mrs. Fielding swore Miss Farnsworth did not leave her home last night, unless, of course, she was carried there." A silence fell, heavy and suffocating. The sound of the rain beyond the windows grew louder, as if the city itself leaned in to listen. Then Holmes's tone softened. "Mr. Blythe, art has its perils. Some lose themselves in color, others in illusion. But when one's muse ceases to breathe, the distinction between portrait and confession becomes dreadfully thin." Blythe's hand went to his brow. "You think me capable of harm, of murder?" No, you are wrong. She wished to leave me, yes, but I loved her. I could not." His voice broke, and for a moment the mask of the painter fell away, revealing the frightened child beneath. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Have a man placed at this door. Mr. Blythe is not to be arrested yet, but neither should he be allowed to vanish as deftly as Miss Farnsworth." He moved toward the painting once more and leaned close, his nose almost touching the canvas. Then, with a small motion of his hand, he plucked from the lower edge a single thread of golden silk embedded deep within the paint itself. "Ah," he murmured, "our little filament returns." He pocketed the thread and nodded toward me. "Come, Watson. We must examine the Academy's storerooms. I have a suspicion our missing lady left more than her likeness behind." Blythe called after us as we turned to go. "Mr. Holmes, if she is truly missing, find her. Whatever I am not her jailer." Holmes paused at the threshold. "No, Mr. Blythe, but perhaps you are the man who opened the door for the one who is." The afternoon had darkened into a watery twilight by the time Holmes and I descended into the underbelly of the Academy of Fine Arts. The sound of rain striking the skylights above faded as we went down a narrow staircase, lit only by a single flickering lamp. The walls were damp, the air heavy with the acrid scent of varnish and the faint, unmistakable trace of camphor. Holmes moved ahead with his lantern held high, its glow throwing long, uncertain shadows across the stone floor. The space we entered was neither cellar nor proper workshop. It had the eerie quality of a place forgotten deliberately. A clutter of old frames, discarded easels, and cracked plaster busts filled the corners like the remnants of an artist's confession. "Observe, Watson," Holmes said quietly. "No dust upon the steps, yet cobwebs upon the shelves. The upper rooms have seen years of use, but this chamber only hours." He crouched, running a gloved finger across a faint mark in the dust, an oval indentation, smooth-edged. A stool moved recently. And here drag marks leading to that wall. Following the direction of his lantern, I saw that one portion of the wall differed subtly in color from the rest. The bricks there seemed newer, the mortar lighter, as though replaced in haste. Holmes tapped them with the handle of his cane. A hollow echo replied. He smiled faintly. "Excellent." I had feared Mr. Blythe might lack the audacity required for concealment. Lestrade, who had followed us down with a reluctant expression, gave a short laugh. "You think there's a hidden door? What next? Holmes, an underground gallery?" "Perhaps," Holmes murmured, "or perhaps something less aesthetic." He pressed his palm flat against the bricks, searching for irregularities. After a moment, his fingers found a small iron catch disguised beneath a streak of paint. With a click, the section of wall swung inward, releasing a gust of cold, stale air. Inside lay a narrow passage. Holmes raised the lantern, revealing a low-ceilinged chamber no larger than a modest sitting room. The sight that met us made my blood run cold. In the center of the room stood an easel draped with a cloth, and beside it, a stool upon which rested a folded shawl, the very one we had seen in Miss Farnsworth's drawing room. Against the far wall, a long table held an assortment of bottles, brushes, pigments, and beneath them, a pair of women's gloves, one torn at the thumb. "Good Lord," I muttered. "Holmes, what in heaven's name?" He raised a hand for silence. Moving to the table, he examined the bottles. "Ether," he murmured, "and here, tincture of laudanum. Strong concentrations. No mere artist supplies these. Whoever used this room required sedation." Lestrade swore under his breath. "You think Blythe drugged her, painted her while she—" "Patience, Inspector," Holmes interrupted, his tone cold and precise. "Let us not leap to conclusions before evidence permits the leap. See here." He drew aside the cloth from the easel. Beneath it, to my horror, was another portrait of Miss Farnsworth, but unfinished. Her face here was not serene, as in the upstairs canvas, but half completed, the outline of her features traced in faint pencil. The brushstrokes that did exist were wrong, hurried, almost frantic. The eyes had not yet been filled, and the mouth was barely shaped, caught somewhere between speech and silence. Holmes stared at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, quietly, he said, "This is no artist's tribute. It is a study of possession." He turned to the table once more and picked up a small object I had not noticed before, a gold locket, its chain broken. Inside was a miniature photograph of Miss Farnsworth, smiling faintly. But opposite the photograph, pasted onto the facing side, was a clipping of a man's name from a newspaper, Adrian Blythe. She bound her own image to his name, Holmes murmured. And when she sought to break that bond, he sought to preserve it in pigment, if not in flesh. Lestrade stepped forward, rubbing the back of his neck. "That settles it. He's our man. We'll take him in at once." But Holmes was not listening. His eyes had fixed upon the lower portion of the wall, where a faint patch of discoloration marred the plaster. Kneeling, he pressed his hand to it, and it shifted slightly. He struck it once with the cane. The plaster cracked, and a hollow thud followed. Behind it lay a wooden crate. Inside, coiled in neat precision, was a length of golden silk thread, the same that Holmes had found in the violin case and beneath the missing woman's chair. He lifted it gently, holding it up to the lamplight. "You see, Watson? The same material used perhaps to secure something or someone. but not tightly. The fibers show no strain. Then it wasn't used to bind her? I asked. No, Holmes said softly. To mark her. He turned to Lestrade. Arresting Blythe now would satisfy justice, perhaps, but not truth. There is another hand here, one more subtle. Blythe is vain, obsessive, but not calculating. No, someone used his vanity as brush and palette both. Lestrade looked baffled. Then who? Holmes's eyes gleamed. The woman who delivered the violin case. She trembled, remember? Trembling not from fear, but guilt. Find her, and we find the missing piece. He turned toward the doorway. Watson, take note, the faint scent of camphor lingers still, but beneath it, another rose oil, of the kind used by ladies in perfume. Miss Farnsworth used none. Mrs. Fielding, however, her companion wore it liberally. I stared. You believe Mrs. Fielding, her own servant, was involved? Holmes smiled faintly. Involved? My dear Watson, I believe she orchestrated the entire affair. Blythe was merely the instrument. He glanced once more at the painting, the hollow eyes, the unfinished lips, and lowered the lantern. We must return to Dorset Square at once. The lady who vanished and may yet be found. The question is, did she vanish of her own accord or under the hand that served her breakfast? As we climbed back toward the street, the fog pressed closer, swallowing the last light of day. Holmes walked swiftly, his face set in that grim focus I had come to dread. Holmes, I said as we reached the carriage, you think Mrs. Fielding deceived both Miss Farnsworth and Blythe? He paused before stepping in. No, Watson. I think she deceived everyone, including the one who knocked twice. And as the cab rolled once more into the darkness, I could not shake the image of that half-painted face frozen forever between speech and silence, as if waiting for the sound of a second knock that would never come. It was well past 9 when we returned to Dorset Square. The rain had ceased, but the mist hung thick over the street like a funeral veil, curling around the gas lamps until they glowed like small, mournful moons. The Farnsworth residence appeared darker than before, its windows unlit, its curtains drawn. Only the faint glimmer of a fire behind the parlor shutters betrayed life within. Mrs. Clara Fielding opened the door herself. Her manner was composed, her grey hair arranged with severe neatness beneath a mourning cap, though I could not recall her ever having worn one before. Her eyes, sharp and colourless as polished slate, flicked from Holmes to me, with a look that was neither surprise nor relief, merely calculation. Mr. Holmes, she said evenly, I did not expect your return at this hour. Have you found Miss Farnsworth? Holmes removed his hat and stepped into the dim hallway. Not yet, Mrs. Fielding, but I rather think Miss Farnsworth is closer than you would have us believe. The woman's face betrayed no emotion. Closer, sir? Indeed, Holmes said lightly. The scent of rose oil clings still to her rooms, though you have no doubt done your best to air them. You use camphor to disguise it, an old trick, but not a perfect one. A small tremor passed through her gloved hands, but she recovered almost instantly. You speak in riddles, Mr. Holmes. Riddles are but truths that have not yet met confession, Holmes replied. I would prefer, however, to discuss this matter by the fire. I find warmth loosens tongues more readily than cold. She hesitated, then led us into the parlor. The room was much as we had left it earlier, neat, proper, and utterly lifeless. The breakfast tray had been removed, though the faint ring of a coffee cup remained upon the table's surface. A single coal glowed dully in the hearth. Holmes seated himself before it, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. Tell me, Mrs. Fielding, he began softly, how long had you been in Miss Farnsworth's employ? 4 years, she replied. And during that time, did she ever speak of her former life of the estate in Surrey, or the inheritance left by her late father? Rarely, said the housekeeper. Miss Farnsworth was of delicate temperament. She preferred not to dwell on unhappy memories. Unhappy? Holmes repeated. Indeed. Yet her bank records suggest she maintained a comfortable independence until recent months. You see, Mrs. Fielding, I make it my business to know such things. Her gaze hardened. You've been prying into her finances? Into yours, actually, Holmes said quietly. You draw your wages from an account that does not belong to Miss Farnsworth. The name upon it is Lydia Farnsworth Fielding. For the first time, the mask cracked. Her lips parted in silence. Holmes rose, his voice calm but cutting. The two women were not mistress and servant, they were half-sisters, conceived of the same father, divided by inheritance. Lydia Farnsworth, the legitimate daughter, lived here, believing her past buried. Clara Fielding, the disinherited one, entered her household under the guise of servitude. You called her Mrs., while she called you friend. But neither word was true, was it? Mrs. Fielding's hand gripped the chair back. How could you know that? Because, madam, I have eyes. The letters in the bureau upstairs bear handwriting that matches yours. You copied them often, perhaps to forge a signature later, and in the ash of the fireplace there remains the faint corner of a document, legal parchment, burned in haste. A will, I believe. Her composure collapsed entirely. I never meant her harm, she whispered. I only wanted what was mine. My father left everything to her, the house, the income, the name. She never even knew of me until I came to her door. I meant to frighten her. Nothing more. Watson and I exchanged a glance. Holmes's tone softened, but only slightly. And yet, you were not alone in your scheme. Mrs. Fielding sank into the chair nearest the fire. No, she said bitterly. Adrian Blythe, he was her suitor. Once before he discovered her fears. She had a nervous weakness, you see. Darkness, confined spaces, the sound of sudden knocks, they unstrung her. Blythe learned to use that. I told him only to help me persuade her to release some of her funds. But he wanted more. He believed if he could make her vanish, her fortune might fall to her next of kin, me. Holmes's eyes flickered. And so, you staged a disappearance. Blythe at the door, you at her side. 2 knocks, a fainting spell, and when she woke, she was already gone. Mrs. Fielding's voice trembled. It was meant to be temporary. She was hidden, safely. I swear it, in the room beneath Blythe's studio. But he grew strange, possessive. He said she belonged to him, that she was his perfect subject. He wouldn't let me near her. I begged him to release her, but he only painted, always painting. Her words dissolved into sobs. The fire cracked softly. Holmes leaned forward. When you brought me the violin, in case you were trying to tell me something. She nodded miserably. I didn't know who else could stop him. I thought if I left a clue, if someone clever enough saw the thread. Holmes stood abruptly. Watson, fetch Lestrade. He is to place constables at once around the academy. There may yet be time. I hurried toward the hall, but before I reached the door, a sound stopped me cold. A sharp, deliberate knock. 2 raps upon the front door, the exact rhythm of the note we had first received. Mrs. Fielding froze. Holmes turned toward the sound, his expression unreadable. Watson, he said quietly. Stay where you are. He crossed the room and opened the door. A gust of fog rolled in, but no one stood outside. Only an envelope lay upon the step, pale against the stone. Holmes bent, retrieved it, and returned to the fire. He broke the seal and held the paper to the light. The note contained only 6 words, written in Lydia Farnsworth's unmistakable hand. Do not search. I am free now. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The mist thickened outside, and the house seemed to exhale some long-held breath. Holmes folded the letter carefully. So, he said at last, the lady who was taken now claims liberty, but freedom purchased through whose hand, I wonder? He turned to Mrs. Fielding. Tell me truthfully, did she write to you from beyond her confinement, or did someone else compose this farewell? But Mrs. Fielding only stared into the flames, her eyes wide and glassy. "She said she'd never be found," she murmured. That's what he told her to say. And outside, through the veil of fog, came the faint echo of a second knock so distant it might have been memory itself. Morning came to Dorset Square with a dull, colourless light. The rain had washed the fog into puddles that mirrored the grey sky above, and the street outside was silent except for the distant clip of carriage wheels on wet cobblestones. Inside Farnsworth House, the remnants of the previous night's confrontation hung thick in the air. Fear, guilt, and something else, the faint, sweet trace of rose oil. Mrs. Fielding had been taken to Scotland Yard under Lestrade's supervision, protesting her innocence but too shaken to resist. Holmes and I remained behind at his insistence. There was, he declared, one truth yet to rise from the ashes. He now stood before the cold hearth, sleeves rolled up, his sharp profile caught against the grey morning light. The ashes from last night's fire had been carefully gathered into a basin. Holmes sifted through them with a small brush, his movements delicate and precise, as though excavating a buried relic. "Watson," he said without looking up, "have you ever noticed how lies burn differently from paper?" I glanced at him, puzzled. "I cannot say that I have." He smiled faintly. "Lies are seldom pure cellulose, my dear fellow. They are laced with anxiety, often in the form of foreign ink, pressure marks, or hasty corrections. When burned, such things leave denser carbon residue fragments that resist total destruction." He pointed to a small curl of half-charred parchment among the ashes. I leaned closer and saw that faint traces of writing remained lines and loops that might once have formed words. Holmes took a pair of tweezers and lifted it gently into the light. "There we are," he murmured. "The ghost of a letter." He placed the fragment upon a sheet of white paper and began to reconstruct the surviving lines with a soft pencil, shading carefully until faint impressions emerged. As he worked, I began to discern words. "The violin case will reach him. Conceal it until..." And below that, the partial signature. "C. F. Clara Fielding," I said quietly. "Precisely," Holmes replied. "But note the phrasing. Reach him." The letter was not intended for Miss Farnsworth. It was meant for Blythe. Mrs. Fielding sent the violin case as a signal, not a plea. She believed the act would trigger something, perhaps a rendezvous. I frowned. Then she lied about her attempt to expose him? "Only half," said Holmes. "She sought to control him through confession, but fear is a poor leash." Blythe slipped it easily. He set the paper aside and rose, pacing the room. "There is another matter, the letter we found upon the doorstep last night, supposedly from Miss Farnsworth. Its tone was peculiar, calm, detached, and most curiously written in her own hand, though she could not have composed it from her place of confinement. You suspect forgery? Not precisely. The handwriting was hers, but not of her own will. Observe, Watson. The spacing, irregular. The slope, hesitant. She wrote under duress. I felt a chill. Then she still lives. Holmes stopped pacing. That, my dear Watson, is precisely what I intend to discover. But the message, do not search, that was not written to deter the police. It was written for Mrs. Fielding alone. It was the signal of completion. Completion? Yes. The moment Miss Farnsworth's letter was delivered, Mrs. Fielding knew the arrangement was finished. Whether that meant ransom, silence, or death depends upon what lay beneath the studio. He took up his coat. Come, Watson. Lestrade will have Blythe under watch at the academy, but there is one room he will not have searched thoroughly enough. By the time we reached Fitzrovia once more, the day had grown sharper, the wind carrying a metallic scent of the Thames. The academy loomed before us like a mausoleum of art, its tall windows still dark from the night. Inside, the porter greeted us nervously and led us down the corridor toward Blythe's studio, now sealed under police guard. Lestrade was there already, hands shoved in his pockets, a look of mild annoyance on his face. "Holmes, I've had my men comb this place top to bottom. No sign of the woman." Blythe's half mad, babbling about visions and muses. Holmes nodded curtly. "Excellent. Then we may proceed without interruption." He strode past Lestrade and straight to the corner of the room, where the floorboards bore faint scratches. "You see these, Inspector? Parallel. Close together. Too regular for accident. Something heavy was dragged here, perhaps a trunk." With Lestrade's reluctant permission, Holmes knelt and pried up one of the boards. Beneath it lay a narrow recess, barely the depth of a coffin lined with black velvet. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper and a fragment of torn fabric, pale against the darkness. Holmes lifted the fabric first. It was silk, gold-threaded, and faintly perfumed with camphor and rose. "The missing length," he said softly. "Watson, look closely. The fibers are damp, but not with water." I hesitated before speaking. "Blood?" Holmes gave no answer. He unfolded the sheet of paper. On it were 4 words, scrawled in desperate haste. He knocked. She woke. Holmes's face hardened. "Not," he knocked twice. "Not this time. One knock. The first summons her awakening. The second was never needed." Lestrade shifted uneasily. "Then she's dead?" Holmes shook his head. "No, something far more peculiar." These words were not written by Blythe, see the hand. Feminine, trembling. Miss Farnsworth wrote this herself, moments before or after her supposed disappearance. Whatever transpired here, she was conscious, aware, and willing to leave this message. He replaced the paper carefully. "Inspector, this chamber was no tomb. It was a cocoon. The lady was neither killed nor abducted. She was transformed into something else. The question is, by whose design?" "You're losing me, Holmes." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then let us simplify. A woman vanishes without trace, a painter obsessed with preserving beauty, and a sister who wishes for inheritance. Both needed Lydia Farnsworth gone, but only one required her alive." He turned toward the door. "Mrs. Fielding may have thought she buried a sister. I suspect she preserved her instead." Lestrade blinked. "Preserved her? In pigment," Holmes murmured. "Watson, recall the first portrait so lifelike it chilled you. Blythe painted her last week, you said." "No, he painted her yesterday. The pigment was still moist because it had never truly dried." His gaze turned distant. "Find me that canvas, Lestrade. Bring it to Baker Street. Tonight, we peel back the paint and see what truth lies beneath the brush." As we left the academy, the afternoon sun broke briefly through the clouds, glinting off the wet cobblestones. It was a brief, pallid light, too pale to warm, too fleeting to comfort. Holmes walked beside me in silence for several streets. At last he said, almost to himself, "She woke, Watson. The question that remains, did she ever truly sleep again?" It was near midnight when Lestrade's men arrived at Baker Street, carrying the wrapped canvas between them as though it were a body. The fog had returned, rolling thick along the street lamps, and even Mrs. Hudson, upon seeing the men ascend our stairs, crossed herself softly before retreating into her room. Holmes had cleared the table in the sitting room, replacing his usual clutter of instruments and books with a single oil lamp, a magnifying lens, and a set of delicate surgical tools I recognized from my own practice. The air was heavy with the faint scent of turpentine. "Set it there, Inspector," Holmes instructed. "Handle it gently. Art, like murder, is most fragile at its edges." Lestrade grunted, laying the canvas flat upon the table. "I'll never get used to your manner of talk, Holmes. A painting's a painting. What's this nonsense about murder in pigment?" Holmes merely smiled, the lamplight catching the glint in his grey eyes. "That, Inspector, is precisely what we shall determine." He motioned for me to stand opposite him, and together we unwrapped the painting. The face of Miss Lydia Farnsworth stared up at us once more, serene, immaculate, and lifelessly beautiful. Every detail was precise, from the fall of her hair to the glint upon her brooch. Yet now, beneath Holmes' steady gaze, there seemed something unnatural in the perfection, an absence of accident, of imperfection, of life itself. "Observe," Holmes said quietly. "The skin tones, too luminous for ordinary oil, too reflective. See how the light clings rather than scatters." I bent closer, frowning. "Indeed, almost waxen," he nodded. "Precisely. The pigment has been mixed with something unusual, something organic. I have seen similar work in preservation experiments, though never upon so grotesque a scale." Lestrade looked appalled. "You mean to say?" Holmes cut him off. "Patience, Inspector. Let us prove what we suspect." He selected a small scalpel from the table and, with meticulous care, began to scrape a narrow line through the surface paint near the edge of the canvas. Each stroke lifted a faint curl of pigment, revealing beneath it a thin layer of pale resin, then, to my horror, something softer still. "Good heavens," I murmured, stepping closer. "Yes," Holmes said gravely. "Skin, preserved beneath varnish and oil." Lestrade staggered back. "My God, you're telling me he painted her onto herself?" Holmes's face remained composed, though I saw the flicker of disgust in his eyes. "No, Inspector. He did not paint onto her. He painted with her. The pigment contains traces of powdered keratin and human fat, the byproduct of preservation oil. Blythe did not kill her outright. He rendered her insensible, perhaps with ether, and then, under that dreadful trance, mixed her essence into his work. The final act of his obsession was not murder, it was transformation." I could scarcely find my voice. "And yet she wrote that note, Holmes. She was alive after she vanished." Holmes nodded. "Alive, yes, but fading. The camphor we smelled was used to arrest decay. She was kept in a half-living stupor while he worked. He knocked. She woke. Those were her words the moment he brought her back from that induced sleep, perhaps to finish his portrait." He leaned over the canvas again, eyes narrowing. "But there is more here. Look closely." Watson at the eyes. I obeyed, and my breath caught. Behind the varnish, beneath the painted irises, something gleamed faintly. A thin, glassy sheen no pigment I knew. Holmes adjusted the lamp, and for one dreadful moment it seemed as though the eyes shifted, catching the light. "She was embalmed," Holmes whispered. "Not dead, not entirely." Blythe employed the ancient practice of liver artifacts, the artist's preservation, a monstrous adaptation of mummification, once rumored among the French surrealists. It allowed a subject to be kept immobile, breathing shallowly, for days. Lestrade swore under his breath. "Then where is she now? Is she?" Holmes' tone grew distant. "Perhaps everywhere, and nowhere." He began to dismantle the wooden backing of the frame. As the final nail came free, a folded scrap of paper fell from between the boards. It was a short note, written in the same delicate, tremulous hand as before. "When he knocks, tell him I am already gone." Holmes studied it in silence. Then, almost tenderly, he placed it beside the painting. The first message was written by her, this one, by him. Blythe knocked twice. The first was his summons. The second, his farewell. He meant to vanish after completing his masterpiece. Lestrade shook his head. "We'll hang him for this." "You may try," Holmes said softly, "but you will not find him." "Not find him?" Holmes gestured toward the frame. "This varnish, thick, uneven, suggests the work was finished in haste. Look here, along the border." He drew a line with his finger along the lower edge, and I gasped. Embedded in the still tacky varnish were 3 strands of dark hair. "His own," Holmes murmured. He sealed himself into his art as well. Whether by madness or design, the artist joined his subject. The second knock, Watson, the one we heard outside the Farnsworth house, was not upon her door. It was the sound of his suicide echoing from afar. For a long while, none of us spoke. The lamplight flickered, and the painted woman's expression seemed to shift again, faintly, almost mournful now, as if aware of the horror she embodied. At last, Holmes covered the canvas with a sheet. "Inspector, have this painting taken to the yard and kept under lock. It is no longer evidence of crime, but of madness. See that it is never displayed." Lestrade nodded mutely, signaling to his men. As they carried it away, Holmes turned to me with that weary detachment which follows his rare moments of emotional strain. "Watson," he said quietly, "art imitates life, but when art seeks to preserve life, it destroys it. Blythe's genius was his curse, and Miss Farnsworth's beauty her undoing." "And Mrs. Fielding?" I asked. "She will live," Holmes said, "and that, I fear, may be punishment enough." He crossed to the window, gazing out into the fog. "The case is closed, yet one mystery remains." "What mystery is that?" Holmes' eyes glinted in the lamplight. "If the lady truly perished beneath his brush, who then knocked upon her door and wrote that first note before she vanished?" The question hung in the silence between us, unanswered, as the fog swallowed the last traces of light from the street below. The morning after the dreadful revelation of the portrait dawned pale and still. The usual rumble of carriages and street vendors seemed subdued, as though London itself held its breath. Holmes sat at the window of our rooms in Baker Street, pipe unlit, gaze distant and unreadable. The events of the night before had left an uncharacteristic heaviness in him, a silence I had rarely seen since our earliest cases together. He spoke at last, without turning from the window. "Watson, do you recall the first message?" He knocked twice. "She was already gone." "Of course," I replied. "It was the very phrase that began this case." Holmes nodded slowly. "And yet, if we trace every act and every hand, the words refuse to align with logic. Blythe could not have knocked twice. He was with her, not at her door. Mrs. Fielding could not have written the message she claimed ignorance of its wording, and I find her confession consistent with fear, not deceit. Which leaves us, my dear fellow, with the most troubling conclusion of all. That someone else was present, I asked. He turned then, his sharp features pale in the wan light. "Precisely. A third presence, a mind operating in silence between the two conspirators, unseen and unacknowledged." I frowned. "But who?" "The constable saw no one leaving the house that morning, which is precisely why we must assume they never left," said Holmes. He rose abruptly and began pacing, his long shadow moving across the carpet like a restless spectre. "Consider the sequence. The door was locked from within. Mrs. Fielding answers a knock, finds no one there, returns and her mistress is gone. But the window, we know, was oiled beforehand. And the trace of chalk powder upon the sill? That was no accident. It was the mark of someone waiting outside, someone she expected." I felt a chill. "You mean she had arranged her own disappearance?" Holmes stopped pacing, eyes glinting. "Not alone. The oil on the latch, the chalk residue, those speak of professional hands. And yet, no forced entry, no theft, no ransom demand. Whoever orchestrated her vanishing wished not for her death, but her removal beyond the reach of either her sister or her suitor." He tapped his fingers together. "There is only one person who fits such precision, a protector disguised as a threat." Before I could speak, a knock came at the door once, then twice, precisely spaced. Holmes froze. Mrs. Hudson appeared, wide-eyed, holding an envelope. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes. A man left this just now, said it was to be delivered in person, and no questions asked." Holmes took the envelope silently, his expression unreadable. He broke the seal and read. His lips tightened. "It is signed by Lydia Farnsworth," he said softly. "But this time, the message is different." He handed it to me. The paper trembled faintly in my grasp. Do not condemn the painter. He obeyed a greater hand. I am safe. Seek the man with chalk upon his gloves. Holmes's voice, when he spoke, carried that quiet, deadly certainty I had come to fear. Watson, we have been blind. The chalk, always the chalk. The supposed trace of an artist was never Blythe's at all. It belonged to the one who prepared the window, who oiled the latch, who marked the sill for a clean ascent and descent. Someone who knew Blythe's habits and Mrs. Fielding's fears intimately. I felt my pulse quicken. Then who was it? Holmes moved to the mantel and retrieved the violin case, the very one that had first arrived at our door. The case was meant for me, but it was crafted by another hand, one familiar with my methods, even my instruments. He opened the clasp. Inside, where the violin should have rested, lay a small metal cylinder and a folded strip of paper. "Good heavens!" I murmured. "What is that?" "A magnesium flare," said Holmes. "Used by stage illusionists to create blinding light. Note the residue on the velvet chalk dust." Watson, our mysterious third hand, was no servant, no artist, but a magician. A magician? Indeed. A man accustomed to disappearance, one who stages vanishing acts under the guise of art. I recalled a name from the Academy's ledgers. Henri Calvet, a French illusionist recently expelled for unethical practices. He specialized in optical preservation, claiming to make the dead appear lifelike upon canvas. Holmes' gaze darkened. He and Blythe had collaborated once before, years ago. I believe Calvet found in Miss Farnsworth the perfect subject for his most blasphemous illusion. Not a painted likeness, but a living one suspended between existence and extinction. Who had been listening in stunned silence, found his voice. "Then she is alive?" "Alive, yes," Holmes replied. "But if Calvet's methods hold true, she no longer possesses the will of her own. Her consciousness would drift between waking and sleep, preserved through vapors of ether and light exposure. A living statue, obedient to command." I shuddered. And Blythe? And Blythe? Used as a pawn. Calvet fed his obsession, guided his hand, and ensured that when the final portrait was complete, both would vanish, one painted, one damned. Holmes folded the note. But Lydia Farnsworth's final message changes everything. Seek the man with chalk upon his gloves. She implies awareness, perhaps rebellion. She escaped him once before. The second knock. Watson, the one that haunted her, was not his call to enter, but hers to depart. She left her house by design, not abduction. She was already gone when he came. He began pacing again, the energy returning to his step. 2 knocks. The first, the illusionist's signal. The second, her own. Lestrade blinked. "Then where in blazes is she now?" Holmes stopped before the window, staring into the fog-drenched street below. "Every stage magician requires an audience," he murmured, "and every act of vanishing, a curtain." He turned, eyes blazing with sudden clarity. "She is in the theater. Watson, the abandoned performance hall behind the Academy. Calvet's old haunt. That is where this ends." Without another word, Holmes swept up his coat and strode for the door. I followed, my heart pounding. Outside, the gas lamps flickered weakly through the mist as our carriage thundered toward Fitzrovia once more. Somewhere ahead, beyond the rain-slick streets and shuttered facades, a stage waited, a place where art, obsession, and deceit would meet for their final bow. And as the wheels struck the cobblestones in a rhythmic pulse, I could not help but think of that cursed phrase again. He knocked twice. She was already gone. It no longer sounded like despair. It sounded like escape. The cab clattered through Fitzrovia, the horses' hooves striking sparks from the wet cobbles. The fog had deepened into something almost tangible, a grey curtain swallowing the lamps one by one. Even the driver's whip cracked, muffled in the damp air. Inside, Holmes sat rigid and silent, his eyes half closed, his face drawn with a concentration so fierce it seemed carved in marble. At last, the carriage slowed before a hulking shape that loomed from the mist, a building long dead to music and laughter. Its sign, the Adelphi Pavilion, hung askew, the gilding eaten away by soot. One of the grand front doors stood slightly open, breathing a faint draught that smelled of dust and oil paint. "Calvet's Theatre," Holmes murmured, "a fitting place for the final illusion." We entered by the side door. My lantern beam cut through the darkness to reveal a vast auditorium in ruin. Rows of velvet seats rotted in silence, and the stage curtains sagged like funeral drapes. Yet beneath the decay there lingered the ghost of grandeur, a faint memory of applause still trapped in the rafters. Holmes motioned for quiet. Somewhere beyond the stage, a slow, rhythmic sound echoed: tap, tap, pause, tap. It was not footsteps, but metal against wood, steady and deliberate. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. "I do," said Holmes. "The knocking that never ends." He mounted the stage, his movements noiseless. I followed close behind, my revolver ready. We passed between towering scenery flats until we reached the back wall, where a narrow staircase descended into the orchestra pit below. The sound was louder here. Holmes signaled for me to extinguish the lantern. Then he struck a match and held it aloft. The small flame revealed a chamber lined with mirrors, warped and blackened by age. At the center stood a single easel, and upon it, beneath a sheet of muslin, the outline of another canvas. A voice drifted from the darkness. "You are late, Mr. Holmes." From the far corner stepped a tall man in a threadbare coat, his face pale and fine as porcelain, his gloved hands chalk white. The illusionist, Henri Calvet. His eyes gleamed with a cold, theatrical delight. "I feared," he said softly, "you would never see." The performance completed. Holmes's tone was calm. "I seldom attend revivals of old tricks, Calvet. They tend to end badly for the magician." Calvet smiled. "Ah, but this one has no end. Observe." He drew back the muslin cloth. Beneath it was no painting, but a glass enclosure, a kind of upright coffin lit from within by hidden lamps. And there, standing motionless inside, was Lydia Farnsworth. Her skin was pale as ivory, her eyes open but unseeing. She stood as though in a trance, one hand raised delicately toward the glass. A faint mist coiled about her, smelling of ether and roses. I gasped. "Good God, she's alive!" "Alive," Calvet echoed, "but perfected. She breathes, yet feels nothing. Think of it, Doctor, a woman liberated from decay, from sorrow, from all impermanence. The art of endurance made flesh." Holmes stepped forward, his voice low and deadly. "You call this endurance? You have turned life into exhibit. She is not your muse. She is your prisoner." Calvet spread his hands. "She chose it, Mr. Holmes. She came to me, desperate to escape the cage of inheritance and the cruelty of those who coveted her. She knocked twice upon my door, and I granted her oblivion." "Lies," I hissed. Holmes's gaze never wavered. "Not entirely. She may indeed have sought refuge, but you transformed her search for freedom into spectacle. You preserved her body, but erased her mind. You are no illusionist, Calvet. You are an embalmer of the living." The man's composure faltered. "You do not understand. When she wakes, she remembers nothing. The perfect subject. She is serenity itself." "Then let us test your serenity," said Holmes. Before Calvet could move, Holmes struck the lantern from my hand and smashed it against the floor. Flames leapt up with a roar, licking at the rotted boards. In that instant of chaos, Holmes reached the glass enclosure and wrenched open the hidden latch at its base. A hiss of gas escaped. The lamps within flickered out. "Watson!" he shouted. "Help me!" Together we dragged the fainting woman free as smoke billowed around us. Calvert lunged forward, shrieking, but Holmes caught him by the wrist. The two men struggled briefly, shadows wrestling amid the blaze. Then Calvert tore loose, stumbled backward, and vanished into the falling curtain as the stage collapsed in flame. We carried Miss Farnsworth out through a side passage just as the roof gave way behind us. The night air struck cold and clean after the heat. Lestrade's men, summoned by Holmes earlier, swarmed the street, dousing the fire and seizing what remained of Calvert's apparatus. Of the illusionist himself, no trace was found, only a pair of chalk-stained gloves upon the steps, smouldering faintly. Hours later, at Baker Street, Lydia Farnsworth lay upon our couch, her pulse weak but steady. Holmes watched her in silence until she stirred, whispering through cracked lips. He knocked twice. "Yes," Holmes said gently. "And you were already gone." A tear slid down her cheek. "I wanted to disappear, but not like this." "You will live," Holmes told her, "and perhaps that is punishment enough for him." When she slept, he turned to me, weary but grimly satisfied. "There was never any magic in Calvert's art, Watson. Only chemistry, suggestion, and cruelty. Yet I suspect he believes, even now, that he succeeded." I asked softly, "Do you think he survived?" Holmes drew the curtain aside and looked out into the whitening dawn. "A man who makes a profession of vanishing seldom dies where witnesses can see him. Perhaps one day we shall hear another knock." He let the curtain fall. "Until then, the world has one fewer illusion, and one woman returned to life." The fire crackled softly. Outside, London awoke, unaware of the nightmare that had burned away in its sleep, and so ended the strangest of our adventures, in which art became death and death art. Holmes poured 2 cups of coffee, handed me one, and said with that faint, ironic smile of his, "Watson, when next you hear a knock in the night, I suggest you let it pass unanswered."